For Italian-American immigrants faced with discrimination, Christopher Columbus was both a source of ethnic pride and a passage to assimilation. That's the chapter of Boston history commemorated by the statue near the North End that was just removed after having been vandalized earlier this week. If many of us grew up with the Columbus who discovered America, we've also come to know him as an agent of imperial domination and a vector of a deadly epidemic. That's why the history and control of the narrative are of special concern for Native peoples. To share some of that perspective is the president of the board of directors at the North American Indian Center in Boston, Jean-Luc Pierite. Thank you very much for being with us, Jean-Luc. Jean-Luc, tell me a little bit about your background, because your Native American background, and I believe this goes back to Louisiana.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And of course, before we share any words, we do want to recognize that we are on the traditional indigenous territory of the Massachusetts Nation, who continue to this day in part through the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapog. Myself, as you recognize, I am originally from New Orleans. I'm a member of the Tunica Biloxi tribe of Louisiana, and living and working here in Boston and serving as the president. Yes, I think roots in Louisiana, specifically some of the activism that I have been involved with in the past year. I've actually had the opportunity to go back to Louisiana and participate in the Dred Scott performance art piece, the Slave Rebellion reenactment, which was a reenactment of the 1811 German Coast Uprising. And as being part of that reenactment, we were acknowledging the shared history of Black and Indigenous peoples. That story, even though in the performance piece we sort of marched triumphantly into the French Quarter, unfortunately that story had a tragic ending, and I think it was like 50 participants were decapitated, and there's actually a memorial to those people involved in that uprising at a plantation called Whitney Plantation outside of New Orleans. So I mentioned that because that was kind of my context going into how I personally received the action that resulted in the beheading of the Columbus statue. I think that, especially when we talk about symbols and the flag that's over our head here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the man that's on that flag is Metacom, or as he's known by his English name, King Philip, who was also beheaded, and his head was placed on a pike for 25 years. So, when we're talking about the action and the message that was behind it, while we do not know specifically who can claim responsibility for that, we don't know if it was a member of our community at North American Indian Center specifically, or somebody outside of even the movement that was probably just doing this to provoke the conversation. The message, though, is clear: is that there has been a campaign of state violence against Black and Indigenous peoples for over 500 years. And it was something that, we're in this moment in the present day, talking about the murder of George Floyd and other Black and Indigenous brothers and sisters. So definitely there is pain that we need to convey. But, in our role as a social service organization and providing the tools for civic engagement for our community members, we try to find productive ways in which to get that message out, whether through public testimony, legislative advocacy, or just getting out the vote with our people.
I want to come back to the flag because, I knew enough Latin to look at the words and frankly be puzzled by them. But why is that very narrative on that flag basically that wiping out, or at least subjugating the native peoples was a good thing for Massachusetts. Why is that narrative so harmless? I mean, so harmful at a time like this when a lot of people might say, well, that's just symbolic.
Yeah, and the state seal itself has had several iterations. There have been versions of the state seal that have had a native person who may or may not have been a more representative of the people who have lived here and are living here in Massachusetts. But that there was one seal that had a word bubble that said, come over and save us or help us. And this sort of like narrative that gets enforced by the symbols and the identity of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is harmful either way. Either sort of like validating the colonial experiment or even memorializing what our current seal does, which is it's a mishmash of violence. So we have the disembodied arm of Mild Standish brandishing a sword above the actual shield itself. But the figure of the Native American in the seal is actually a composite. So you have the head of Thomas Littleshell, who is an Ojibwe chief. You have the body, which the proportions were based off a skeleton that was uncovered in an archaeological dig. And you have the sash, which was specifically designed off of King Philip's sash. And so when we're talking about the way that that body was composited, we're talking about that, again, a decapitated form, but then we're just going to just place another head on top of it because this person looks Indian enough. So there's a lot that gets coded into that, but it's also evocative of that war that was fought almost 350 years ago. And we're also seeing, in this century, we're seeing some effects from that war. It was only 15 years ago, in 2005, when the Boston Indian Imprisonment Act was repealed, which made it illegal for Native Americans to walk the streets of Boston unescorted. And that was a law that dates back to that wartime. And that imagery dates back to that wartime. At a recent action, I was kind of charged with holding up a sign for Breonna Taylor with the slogan, "Say her name," and holding up a banner like that for an extended period of time. It actually is pretty, it tests your strength of your arms and whatnot. But in doing that, like, you're holding up somebody, you're honoring somebody, you're holding up their name, you're making sure that their story is not forgotten. Many people that see the state flag will not be able to tell you that is Metacom in that flag. And they will not be able to tell you like the way that he died and how that is encoded, if they're even able to remember what that state flag looks like. So what we're trying to do is remind people through the legislation that was put forth also by Representative Byron Rushing for the past 35 years. We're carrying on that fight that he had championed for so long in order to like come together and forge a new symbol that is representative of the Massachusetts that we want to be today.
Coming back to Columbus as the vector of disease, how does that play now when you see what's happening with the disparities on the effect of COVID-19 among Native peoples throughout at least the whole hemisphere here?
Yeah, and thank you for acknowledging that, because a lot of what we talk about when we talk about colonialism and state violence, there's also the factor of epidemics and pandemics and diseases that have affected our peoples. Right now, the Department of Public Health does, report numbers of racial and ethnic data. And unfortunately, that data, I think around the order of 40% is missing racial and ethnic data. And even that data that is reported, it does not distinguish American Indian, Alaska Native individuals in the cases. And so what that does, it has a ripple effect. So for tribal governments, like the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and the Wampanoag tribe of Aquinagayhead, that are federally recognized, that have access to Indian Health Services. Of course, they can have their own numbers, they can report their own numbers, but to have those statewide numbers as well, it would help to kind of like prove the case of like, this is the need in Massachusetts. For urban Indian organizations like North American Indian Center of Boston and our partner organization, Native American Lifelines, based in Dorchester, we rely upon state numbers. And so any sort of like undercount or no count at all impacts our ability to access resources, to provide social services for our community members who are affected by housing security issues. We have a homeless population. We have, of course, you know, as everybody is impacted by the economic fallout, we're starting to see the impacts here at NACOB. We run a Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act program funded through Department of Labor. So all of those impacts we're taking into account based upon the clientele that we have, the community members that we're able to service. But again, we need accurate reporting of our data from the state level.